Record. Okay.
I notice it's being transcribed at the bottom of the screen. Do you want that?
Mhm.
It's typing what you're saying. Okay.
And we're live. Go.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us, and a special thank you to the Institute of Culinary Education for sponsoring our event, and to Colangelo PR for donating time and managing this webinar. I am Jen O'Flanagan, founder of Feast PR and current co-president of Les Dames d'Escoffier New York. We are the first and largest chapter of Les Dames d'Escoffier International, which has 45 branches worldwide. Our mission is to advance and support aspiring professional women in food and beverage. And one of the most important things that we do is to grant scholarships to promising young women. You can find out more by visiting our website, www.ldny.org. We also champion critical industry issues, such as the one that we're highlighting today. The embedded culture of harassment in all sectors of the hospitality industry, committed by employers, colleagues, clients, and customers alike, has to stop. Harassment is insidious and needs to be attacked from every angle. Our goal is to empower the victims to defend themselves legally, physically, and professionally. We knew we needed a sharp, passionate fellow Dom to take the lead, and we found her in Melanie Young, whose moniker, Fearless and Fabulous, could not be more fitting. Melanie is a co-host and producer of the Connected Table Live, a weekly 50-minute podcast focused on sharing the stories of individuals and legacy families around the world, whose work has helped shape the food and beverage industry. Melanie has tirelessly sought out and brought to us today a range of experts that will speak on addressing sexual harassment from every angle. Melanie, take it away.
Thank you, Jennifer, and welcome everybody to this very important panel, Breaking the Silence. I interview a lot of women in my show for women, Fearless, Fabulous Shoe, and so many of them have experienced some form of harassment. This touches a nerve so deep, so I was so incredibly honored when Jennifer asked me to organize a panel and to moderate. And we're so grateful to the panelists who have joined us today. They are experts in the field. I'm going to start with some very important statistics that we will also share on our screen. Workplace harassment occurs throughout many industries, but it is especially pervasive in the restaurant industry. According to the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, the EEOC, more sexual harassment claims in the United States are filed in the restaurant industry than in any other, where as many as 90% of women and 70% of men reportedly experience some form of sexual harassment. This is from a Harvard Business Review study, January 18, 2018. From 2005 to 2015, the EEOC received about 85,000 sexual harassment complaints. That's about 14.23% of these came from the food and hospitality industry. It's also expensive. In 2019, employers paid out a record $68.2 million to employees alleging sexual harassment violations through the EEOC, which is an increase from the previous all-time high of $56.6 million in 2018. According to a recent study by the nonprofit organization One Fair Wage, whose president joins us today, 41% of the 1,675 service workers surveyed reported they are sexually harassed more often now than they were before the pandemic. And many have reported being harassed for enforcing coronavirus restrictions. Late last year, the New York Times broke a story about sexual harassment within the Court of Master Sommeliers. But there have been many stories about harassment leading up to and since that groundbreaking article. We felt it was time to break the silence and have an open conversation on how we can all be better community citizens to enforce best practices for employers through training and education, and how we can better provide a supportive and safe workplace for our workers. Today's panelists each bring an expertise to this issue, and each will address their specific expertise. At the end, we will take questions from attendees. Thank you to Dom Catherine Gordon from the Institute of Culinary Education, and Carrie Schanenberger from Colangelo Partners, who are going to be vetting and queuing up the questions, which you're welcome to send, but we'll take at the end. I'm going to briefly introduce our panelists. This is in alphabetical order, and you also can go to Eventbrite and ldny.org to see their full biographies. Taryn Abrahams is the founder of Empower Behavioral Services, a corporate behavioral and human interaction expert who helps companies implement behavioral best practices to improve workplace interpersonal relations and holistically strengthen corporate workplace culture. So she will bring a great psychology and behavioral discussion to this webinar. Saru Jayaraman is president of One Fair Wage and director of the Food Labor Research Center at University of California at Berkeley. She has been active in supporting workers' rights, and One Fair Wage is working very hard to raise wages for service workers nationwide. It is the One Fair Wage report that came out on masculine harassment that addressed the fact that sexual harassment and workplace harassment is on the increase since the pandemic. Saru also co-founded the Restaurant Opportunities Center, ROC, which grew into a national movement of restaurant workers, employers, and consumers, which also addressed this topic a few years ago. Theodora Lee is a shareholder at Littler Medicine PC out of California. She's actually joining us from Texas. She is an expert on labor relations and has extensive courtroom experience, specializing in all aspects of employment and labor relations, including wrongful termination, litigation, National Labor Relations Board matters, Title VII, and FEHA proceedings. She also counsels employers on day-to-day employment issues. Ashley Oberdorff is a human resources expert. She is a director of Empowered Hospitality and came to us highly recommended by Dom Victoria James of Cote Steakhouse. Ashley brings more than a decade working in human resources, and her company, Empowered Hospitality, works at creating strong human resource structure and best practices with their clients to offer flexible hands-on HR services and compliance-based recommendations in order to build strong HR foundations. Alpana Signh is a restaurateur, sommelier, and television personality, and she is the inspiration for the title of this webinar, Breaking the Silence. Alpana was the youngest woman master sommelier to earn master sommelier and the first South Asian. And she did this at age 26. She, it's an incredible accomplishment when you think about that at such a young age. She also owns two restaurants in in Chicago, and is the host of the Emmy award-winning show Check Please Chicago. Her poignant post on the cost of remaining silent touched all of us, and she's going to bring an incredible perspective on what happened then and what she has learned from the process, which I think will resonate with many women who are still remaining silent. Lauren R. Taylor is the director of Safe Bars and Defend Yourself. Safe Bars trains hospitality workers in skills for standing up for themselves and others to stop sexual harassment and more. The program has trained more than 40 bars in the Washington, D.C. area where she is based and established Safe Bars programs in 25 cities. Defend Yourself has reached more than 35,000 people of all genders, ages, and walks of life with skills to stop harassment, abuse, and assault. So I want to welcome our panelists today. It's a great, great group. And I'm going to start with Saru. Saru, One Fair Wage issued the report on the state of sexual harassment, masculine harassment, late last year. We'd like you to share a little bit about the findings and who you found through this is most affected and why.
Sure. And Melanie, do you want to just tell me how long I have right now, just so I gauge myself?
Absolutely. I'm giving each panelist at the start like roughly 5 minutes to talk, 5 to 7. Okay. And then after everybody speaks, we'll go back. I'll ask a few questions and take questions from the audience.
Wonderful. Thank you. So I'm going to talk fast, but I think it's important to understand we've done 20 years of research and organizing on the issue of sexual harassment and its connection to, frankly, the wage structure in the restaurant industry. And I want to share some of that and then tell you a little bit about what we found with the pandemic that really proves the point. So first of all, the restaurant industry prior to the pandemic was the nation's second largest and absolute fastest growing private sector employer with close to 14 million workers. So nearly 1 in 10 Americans worked in the restaurant industry prior to the pandemic. And yet, despite the industry's size and growth, it was consistently named by the federal government as the nation's absolute lowest paying employer every single year. And all of our research as to how you've got one of the largest and fastest growing industries with the absolute lowest wages of any industry really can be traced back to the money, power, and influence of the trade lobby, the National Restaurant Association. We call it the other NRA. It really is led by the chains, although it purports to also represent independent restaurants. I think that kind of was revealed to not be the case during the pandemic, but it's really led by the chains. What most people don't know is that the other NRA, as we call it, has been around in various forms since emancipation of slavery. At emancipation, the restaurant lobby demanded the right to hire newly freed slaves, mostly Black women at the time, not pay them anything at all, and have them live entirely on this newfangled idea that had just come from Europe at the time called tips. Tipping originated in feudal Europe. In feudal Europe, it was always an extra or bonus on top of a wage for serfs or vassals. When the idea came to the States, because of slavery, it was mutated into a replacement for wages, particularly for Black women. Black women were told you get a $0 wage as long as tips bring you to the full minimum wage. And that became law in 1938 as part of the New Deal, when everybody got the right to the federal minimum wage for the first time, except for tipped workers who were still mostly women at the time and told you get a $0 wage as long as tips bring you to the full minimum wage. And we went from $0 in 1938 all the way up to $2.13 an hour, which is the current federal minimum wage for tipped workers in the United States of America. And 43 states in the United States still have a sub-minimum wage, which is a legacy of slavery, a direct legacy of slavery. And 40 of those 43 states, so 4 out of 5 states in the US, have wages of $5 or less. So I think before we say anything else, it's so important to understand that the nation's largest employer of women, which the restaurant industry is, pays people $2.13 an hour and less than $5 in 4 out of 5 states. That, right in of itself, is a valuation of the worth of women in America. The fact that the largest employer gets away with legally paying less than $5 an hour to these workers. Today, 70% of tipped workers are women. They are largely waitresses working in all kinds of restaurants. Yes, some in fine dining, but the vast majority work in very casual restaurants, mom and pop diners, IHOPs, Denny's. They struggle with the highest rates of economic insecurity and poverty, 3 times the poverty rate of the rest of the US workforce. They use food stamps at double the rate of the rest of the US workforce. They are largely single mothers. And they had the highest rates of sexual harassment of any industry prior to the pandemic. And all of our research showed that those very high rates of sexual harassment were directly correlated to the sub-minimum wage. Why? Because so many workers told us that service workers, tipped workers told us that they were told by management, dress more sexy, show more cleavage, wear tighter clothing in order to make more money in tips. And that the workers in the 7 states that get a full minimum wage with tips on top, because there are 7 states, including California, where I live, but also Oregon, Washington, Nevada, Minnesota, Montana, and Alaska, all require a full minimum wage with tips on top, as was done in feudal Europe. So 7 states got rid of this legacy of slavery. 43 states persist with this legacy of slavery. The 7 states that got rid of this legacy of slavery, despite what the NRA says, have had booming restaurant industries. In fact, they've had higher restaurant industry sales, higher job growth, and higher rates of tipping. But here's the clincher. They've had 1/2 the rate of sexual harassment in the restaurant industry, 1/2. And that is because women in those states can count on a wage from their boss. They're not completely dependent on the customer to feed their families. And therefore, they are told by managers at 1/3 the rate as workers in the 43 states with a sub-minimum wage, dress more sexy, show more cleavage, wear tighter clothing in order to make more money in tips. In other words, sexual harassment in our industry comes down to the power dynamic between women and male customers, male coworkers, and male managers. And that power dynamic comes down to the fact that most women in our industry are completely dependent on the whims and biases of customers and whether the customers are pleased with their service. And years of research shows that their pleasure with their service has nothing to do with the quality of their service. It has to do with whether they're willing to allow themselves to be touched, the race and gender of the server, her hair color, her eye color, her breast size, and frankly, whether she's willing to tolerate or even encourage the harassment that she gets on a daily basis. All of this became even clearer during the pandemic, even more blatant, because during the pandemic, 6 million of these workers lost their jobs. 60%, 60, could not access unemployment insurance because they were told by most states that their sub-minimum wage of $2 or $3 was too low to meet the minimum threshold to qualify for benefits. And then millions went back to work, and we surveyed thousands. And as you said, Melanie, 41%, a huge number. I mean, when you ask workers whether they experience sexual harassment in our industry, and this is after decades and tens of thousands of surveys, most workers say no, because most workers don't recognize what they're experiencing is sexual harassment. They don't actually, when you ask them, do you experience sexual behavior in the restaurant that is scary or unwanted, 90% say yes. But when you ask them, do you experience sexual harassment, about 20% say yes. They do not make that connection because it is so normalized in our industry that they do not recognize it as something illegal. Well, during the pandemic, 41% of workers said, yes, it went, not only does it exist, it went up. And hundreds of women submitted comments to us from male customers along the lines of, take your mask off so I can see how cute you are and determine how much I want to tip you, which obliterated the idea that tipping is based on the quality of service. It was based on the quality of service. There'd be no reason for her to have to take off her protective gear to be judged on her looks and her tips on that basis. So really what we know is that sexual harassment in our industry has always been based on the power dynamic between women in our industry and the male customers, coworkers, and managers who control her income, how much she can get in her tips. Because her income varies, it goes up and down, they have control. So it's not just the customers determining, do I want to tip you based on how cute you are? It's the fact that when she goes into the kitchen, she has taken an order from a customer and the kitchen staff can say, well, what are you going to do for me to produce that order just as you asked for it? I can't tell you the number of women who've said, I have to flash every day to get the kitchen staff to prepare the meal just as I asked for it. I have to kiss the kitchen staff so that they will prepare the meal just as the customer asked for it. I have to kiss the manager so they'll give me the best shifts and the best sections to get more tips. Because her income goes up and down, because it varies based on the pleasure of the customer, every man, not just the customer, but the coworkers and the managers have power over her. And that just became so much more pronounced, horrifying, and outrageous during the pandemic. And I just want to close by saying this. Beyond all of the horror that I've just shared, two things. One, we are now doing research with Catherine McKinnon, the professor who coined the term sexual harassment, to document the lifelong impact this has on young women, because this is the first job for half of American women. And what we know is that we've heard from hundreds and hundreds of older women. I've experienced sexual harassment later in life, but I did nothing about it because it was never as bad as it was when I was a young woman working in restaurants, which means what we've set up in this industry doesn't just impact the restaurant industry, it impacts the whole economy, women across the economy, because women go on for the rest of their lives thinking that this is the worst it could ever be. Two, this is the last thing I'm going to say, and I promise I'll wrap up. But what I've just described means that restaurant workers have become the only essential workers to not get a minimum wage, and the only essential workers to be asked to remove their protective gear in order for a chance to earn their income. And that has got to be something that drives all of us crazy when we finally learn during pandemic that we're all interconnected. Asking essential workers to remove their protective gear because we have accepted and normalized the sexual harassment in this industry cannot continue. Biden has included elimination of the sub-minimum wage in his COVID relief bill. And so we need everybody to help push for that. Thank you.
Saru, thank you for opening with such a passionate and incredibly eye-opening number of statistics. I'd like to take this to our legal expert because this really goes into a very big topic. Theodora, you work with a lot of employers, and really this is about creating a better workplace environment for workers. What defines harassment legally? We talked about that prior to this. What is harassment, first of all?
Well, thank you. And I just want to pick up on something Saru said, because a lot of these women don't realize what they're experiencing is actually harassment. There are basically two types of harassment: quid pro quo, which I call economic harassment. You know, that's the kind where, you know, you flash me and I'll prepare that meal for you. Or if you go out with me on a date, then I'll make your life easier here. I'll give you the best shift and the best table. That is what we call economic harassment, or this for that. That's the Latin term quid pro quo. And it occurs when a manager or a coworker, like, you know, basically agrees to give you some benefit linked to sex or some type of sexual act or agreement to flirt or to go out on a date or have drinks. And that is a very tangible employment action that people in the restaurant industry, and women in particular, have experienced. And that is the one we hear about all the time, about, you know, powerful men using that to get what they want from not empowered women. The other form of harassment that is prevalent is a hostile work environment. That's when someone engages in some type of conduct, such as physical, verbal, or nonverbal, visual conduct, that's unwanted, and it unreasonably interferes with the employee's ability to perform their job or creates an intimidating, hostile, offensive work environment. That's actually very prevalent in the restaurant business. But a lot of employees don't know that this is what's happening. And because of long tradition, it's been happening. They don't know that they can take action. And there are laws on the books, and there have been laws on the books for years, but the two principal sources would be Title VII of the Civil Rights Act of 1964, and then the state equivalents. I'm in the state of California, where we have the California Fair Employment and Housing Act. Many of you are from New York. The New York City Human Rights Act protects you from sexual harassment, and the New York State Human Rights Law protects you from harassment. I mean, these are important laws that every employee in the workplace should know about. And I know in California and in New York, there is mandatory harassment training, which should be given to everyone in the restaurant industry. Because if we don't know what these laws are and we don't know what we should do, we don't know how to stop this. And one of the things that you asked me to comment is about what should workers do? What should employers do? Workers need to be familiar with these state agencies. They don't need a lawyer. They can go to the EEOC. They can go to the Fair Employment and Housing Commission. They can go to the New York Human Rights Commission and file a claim and let those agencies investigate without the need to actually hire a lawyer, which is very important. And then we can talk about later some of the things that I know our firm spends a lot of time working with employers trying to prevent harassment and training. And so I'll say that for a little bit later, because I think the most important thing that we can take out of today is how to stop it. Look at our environment, figure out what our risks are, and come up with a plan that's specifically tailored to stop it in the tracks.
Thank you, Theodora. Really great points. And, you know, in researching for this webinar, I went to the New York State Commission, and there are some wonderful resources that I also want to underscore to all attendees. This webinar is being recorded. There will be a file available, link on YouTube, and also www.ldny.org. And there will be a list of resources, as well as more information on our panelists. I'd like to talk to Alpana. Again, I said that Alpana was kind of the muse for the title of this webinar. Alpana, I'd like you to share your story and why you chose to break your own silence and what you learned in the process.
Well, the very simple answer of why I chose to break my silence is because I reached a point in my life when I could finally afford to do so. And this is a decision that I made to give up my title as a master sommelier after being in the industry for 25 years. I mean, so if we count the list of accomplishments where I can move away and still operate with some notoriety without a title, it took me 25 years to do so. You know, a TV show, a book, speaking engagements, you know, James Beard nomination, 3 restaurants, you know, so I have this body of work behind me that can speak for me in lieu of a title. And, you know, I have had, you know, this is a decision that I made in early November. It's been obviously a few months now, and I've had time to take in some of the criticism that I received, and also a lot of the support, overwhelming support for what I did. And for those of you who don't know, there was an article in the New York Times that came out in around November about this rampant sexual harassment issue taking place in the Court of Master Sommeliers, where male master sommeliers were leveraging their position within the court in exchange for sexual favors or dating students, and sort of insinuating, you know, that if you take care of me, I'll take care of you. And then if there was sort of a rebuffing of that, then there were consequences where maybe perhaps they didn't get a position, you know, at the exam or whatever it is. And so you can, you know, read it. You know, and I've been a master sommelier since I was 26 years old. I'm 44 now. I'll let you know on that one. And it was a surprise to me as far as the level of harassment, but it wasn't a surprise to me in the sense that the way that the women, when they did lodge their complaint, things were just sort of like fell through the cracks. You know, I've had my own issue with the court, nothing with sexual harassment, but just harassment in general. You know, I passed the exam when I was 26 years old. I was a little bit of my official title was the Enfant Terrible, you know, the terrible infant. And what did I do? What did I really do? I was a confident young woman who wasn't afraid to pursue my seat at the table. And that scared a lot of people, you know, because I didn't fit the mold. I didn't come sponsored, you know, and I was loud and proud, and I still am, but now I've got the body of work behind me, you know, and as I'm listening, especially, you know, to Saru talk, I was just thinking, where do people think that they can get the idea to treat women like this? And I think that this culture of harassing women is so much broader than we realize. I mean, it's everything from what we decide to watch. I mean, I won't watch The Bachelor. I don't know how some of the smartest people I know watch The Bachelor. And like, you do realize that you're just perpetuating the stereotype of what a woman's worth is, to stand there in a pretty dress and accept a rose from a man. And you're watching this with your kids, like, or The Real Housewives. Don't even get me started on that. And it's not innocent, you know, because to me, there's no difference between The Handmaid's Tale or The Handmaid's Tale and The Bachelor. There's no difference, you know, because basically what you're doing is it's a form of identity theft. You're filling in the grid for what you think the value of a woman should be, her body, her sexuality, her need, you know, to bring pleasure to you. You know, and I've long believed in that Gloria Steinem saying of, you know, we raise our girls to be like boys so they can defend themselves. And, you know, even that Sheryl Sandberg lean in philosophy, I'm like, what we should really be doing is raising our boys to be like girls, you know, to bring that empathy and thought and just caring and nurturing. And I think that our spectrum in our society is too far to one sort of gender identity of that sort of masculine thing. And we're all taught as women, you know, stand there like a superhero, you barge in there like a man, be like a man. I'm like, no, men should be like women, you know, and there should be sort of this idea where we can just kind of like find some middle ground and that we can learn from each other. And so I just think that it's just so embedded in our culture that it just bleeds into every other aspect of society, because to me, it just should be a no-brainer that you just don't treat another human being like this. But where do they get this audacity to do that? But going back to your original question of why I decided to is because I got to the place where I could afford to do it. And I know I've spoken to a lot of my, you know, female colleagues within the court, and or even male colleagues, and you know, they're like, I'd love to do what you do, you know, I'd love to walk away, but I can't. Like, I need the title, like I have to pay my bills, I have to like pay my mortgage, and I need this, you know. And I use that title to open a lot of doors, and I know it's a little bit hypocritical of me to, you know, basically use it, and then now I walk away, and you know, what about everybody else? But to me, by walking away from that title, I can speak for the people that can't speak. And I think it sends a message to young women and men, or, you know, people of different gender identities, or, you know, different socioeconomic backgrounds, whatever it is, that you don't have to take it. So let me take it for you so that you don't have to take it, because I can afford to do so. I couldn't do this 15 years ago when I was starting off in my career, but I can do it now. And, you know, the work just doesn't end there. You know, the work continues. You know, it's as simple as, I'm a big fan of micro mentoring. You know, I mean, we're all busy people, but, you know, one thing I've learned particularly from this pandemic is it doesn't take long to do a Zoom call. You know, for me to like meet you for coffee is a little nutty for my schedule, but I can spend 20 minutes in the morning when I'm drinking my coffee at home, and I can meet you on a Zoom call and give you some advice and hear you out and let you know that you know, that you matter, and that your feelings are valid, and that somebody is listening to you. And sometimes that's kind of all we need, you know, just sort of somebody to listen to us and to just validate, that's the word I'm looking for, validate what it is that we're going through. You know, I after that article came out, one thing that I was sort of perplexed by, and a lot of my female colleagues were perplexed by, is how come nobody came to us? What is it about the female master sommeliers that nobody came to us? And it turns out that a couple of the women in the article did come, but nothing happened. You know, so when somebody does come to you and they confide in you, it's an incredible responsibility to follow up on that and to check in with them to see how they're doing. You know, even if you can't do anything about it, to let them know that you tried. Because eventually, you know, yesterday was Martin Luther King Day. And one of my favorite quotes, if not my favorite quote in life, is, the moral arc of the universe is long, but it bends towards justice. And you don't want to be caught in a situation where you could have done something and you did nothing. And it's an incredibly horrible feeling to sit there and have built your career on a title, and to sit and read an article where 27 women were hurt and you did nothing. And, you know, this is not a situation where you just click out of the article and you just go about your day, you know, because let's just say this happens again, and you think about that time where you clicked out of that article and you did nothing. And so for my own peace, for my own soul, for my own sort of like ability to live with myself, I knew that I had to do something, you know, because those women couldn't, you know, and many of them are still thinking about pursuing the title because that's the only avenue that they have. You know, and, you know, when I wrote my post, you can go to my blog at alpanasignh.com and read my posts. You know, I said that no man, woman, institution, you know, whatever it is, has the power to determine your destiny or your life or to control who you are, you know. And then I wrote like a couple sentences later, but I don't know who I would be without this Master Sommelier title. And it's been an interesting journey trying to figure that out. I can't say that it's been easy. I can't say that I don't sit here and go, did I make the right decision? But, you know, I have to say that time will tell. And I want to be so wrong about this, but something tells me that until there are fundamental things that are changed within the court, it's probably going to happen again. And one of those things is that they have this rule where it's completely, well, it's not. So when an examiner is technically not allowed to date a student, right? You're not supposed to fraternize with them, and there's a policy within the sexual harassment code of conduct. But if it does happen, then you have to disclose it. I'm like, so is it legal or is it not legal? Like, you can't have it both ways. It's like being a little pregnant, you know? So like, it needs to be clearly defined. And they said, well, what if somebody falls in love and we can't control people's behavior? And I said, well, companies have these non-fraternization policies. Why can't, there's a precedent that's set. I'm sure Theodora could speak to this. You know, like what we need to have it in the bylaws that you cannot fraternize with the student. And yes, if you fall in love, then you cannot examine for as long as that person is in the, you know, the testing process. I don't understand why this is so difficult. You know, and Emily Wines, who's a really good friend of mine, she's taken over as the new chairperson. And I told her about this, you know, because she's like, we'd love to have you back. And I'm like, until these three things happen, that there's a clearly defined policy about not being able to fraternize with students, and there's a clear penalty for doing so. You have to step out of the testing process. Number two, I want all 27 of those women who came forward in that article and others who were afraid to come forward because they still need to get jobs and things like that, that they're okay with the changes, that they feel comfortable with this organization, that they feel like there's a place for them. And thirdly, I want to hear from the vast number of people of color that have been turned away from this organization, that they feel like there's a place for them, and there's a place for them where they feel safe and included and seen. And until those three things happen, this is no place for me.
Alpana, this is beautiful. I think what you speak to with the court applies across many industries. And I want to underscore that. And something you addressed that I want to now take to Taryn Abrahams is bystander. We were talking about this, the bystander situation. I think Taryn, you said before the webinar, 10% of sexual harassment cases are not reported. What is that? What was that stat?
I was going to say, well, you know, basing it on the statistics that you shared on the first slide, what I wanted to sort of underscore is how many people actually report harassment. We have a suspicion of how many people experience it, but how many people actually report it to their manager, to their HR manager, to the state? And unfortunately, it's a very low number. Only 10% of victims actually report harassment. So I think it really kind of exposes this overall sort of resistance that people have, this fear that prevents people from reporting it. And it really kind of goes back to encouraging companies to create a transparent culture. It really goes back to that. It goes back to, you know, and what is culture? It's funny, if you line 100 executives up and you ask them, how do you define culture? You're going to get 100 different answers. But how I define culture is it's a collection of action, inaction, words, and silence. Simply put, we communicate boldly by the decisions we choose to make, the ones we choose to dodge, the conversations we're willing to have, and the conversations we're willing to not have. And so it really, you know, in my opinion, and this is really what kind of ignited my desire to start my own business a few years ago. My business is very much in reaction to the Me Too movement, because I saw a need in the marketplace, a real need to create better, more effective training around this topic. And the missing piece, I feel, and I'm starting to see the EEOC sort of echo these sentiments, is the importance of arming people with the skills to be able to intervene if they choose to. Right? It's hard to say to someone, well, if you see something, say something, right? That's that mantra we all know through the fight on terrorism. You see something, you say something. That's great. But if you don't have the scripts and the words and the tools to be able to intervene, we're going to do what we all usually do, which is to go silent because it's uncomfortable and we tend to shy away. So bystander intervention is really sort of, I believe, the missing piece to effective training around this conversation. And really, what is bystander intervention? It's really based on the fact that people make decisions and continue behaviors based on the reactions they get from others. It's a very, very powerful concept, something that has been utilized for years on college campuses and universities around the world. It's something that we are now seeing helps with this fight on terrorism, and we're starting to see more and more companies implement this type of training. And it's not a matter of making it a requirement for you to intervene, you know, because some of us are more bold than others. I know I have a bold personality. If I see something and I see someone struggling, I'm going to put myself out there, but that's my personality. Some people aren't as bold. So the bystander intervention conversation gives everybody, based on their personality, different ways to intervene, different tools. If you tend to be a shy person, then maybe you can do something as simple as just document what you see, right? Or follow up with the survivor, right? Or how about create a disruption or a distraction? Hey, you know what, Sally, let's go get that cup of coffee we've been talking about and break it up. You don't have to actually confront the harasser if you know, that's just one of many ways to be an effective bystander. So I think what bystander intervention accomplishes is it creates awareness. It creates a sense of collective responsibility. Again, 10% of people report harassment. It clearly, the part of the answer is arming everybody with these types of skills, giving everybody the toolbox, because the reality is most victims don't speak up. It also gives the victim, or I should say the survivor, a sense of empowerment, right? I mean, God, if, you know, when I experienced harassment years ago, which in hindsight was probably the reason why I'm where I am now, is because I have experienced what it's like to be mistreated. If somebody would have grabbed my hand and said, let's go to HR together, are you kidding me? That would have been I would have spoken up, but I didn't speak up. I felt, you know, maybe there would have been some retaliation. There would have been, or how about worse than retaliation is not being believed or it being minimized. But if someone is holding your hand and going with you, oh my gosh, that's power. That's magic right there. And so I think bystander intervention really gives people a good understanding of how you can exercise your power if you choose to.
Absolutely. And you know, a lot of this, you know, the recurring theme is people are fearful. They're fearful of not being believed. They're fearful of it haunting them in their career, being labeled, as Alpana said, a troublemaker. It will affect their job, and therefore they choose to stay silent. Let's take it to the source of where this really needs to start, which is human resources. One of the things in another seminar I attended, Women in Wine Leadership Symposium, that Victoria James said was every company needs to have an HR office, an HR department, but not a lot of companies in restaurants do, or wine industries I've learned. So Ashley, I want to address why a strong HR program matters for all, and what can smaller companies do that may not have the resources to do it, and give some examples.
Sure. So yeah, any restaurant, whether they're large, small, mom and pop, big corporation, would benefit from having an HR department, because HR tends to be the liaison between operators, management, line level employees, and HR truly actually cares about communication and making sure everyone is on the same page. That decreases a lot of those murky gray areas where issues could arise. And so when we're working with our clients, there are three primary challenges that we like to tackle. So obviously high turnover, 70% annually in hospitality, lawsuits, and then sexual harassment claims, obviously more than any other industry, which is why we're having this panel today. But looking at high turnover, so making sure that our clients have a really strong recruiting and onboarding program. So you'll spend less time having to rehire employees, retrain them if you're hiring smart from the beginning. Also onboarding, so making sure your employees feel welcomed and feel like they're a part of the company. That also will help retain your employees. Looking at lawsuits, so a big thing, we always make our recommendations based on compliance. And so going in and looking, do all employees have an employee file? Are their I-9s correct? Are their rate of pay forms free of errors? Do they have an employee handbook? And if they do, amazing, but are all of the policies up to date? Is there a handbook acknowledgement form that employees can sign? And then looking at sexual harassment claims. So finding that person, if you can't afford an in-house HR person, do you go to an outsourced company like Empowered? Do you have a manager where people feel comfortable talking to this person? Is it a safe space? Doing training. So we do an anti-harassment training called Respect in the Workplace, which obviously focuses on harassment and other pressing issues in hospitality, but really focusing on just respecting one another. Like Taryn said, going off of the bystander responsibility for the management training, just focusing on that as a manager, you have an elevated responsibility to report something, to say something. And then looking at, sorry, the last question. If a small business, small restaurants oftentimes can't afford an in-house person, so what can you do? Identify a manager who maybe likes to take on some HR responsibilities. I know a lot of operators do not, but someone who routinely stays up on the walls. Also, a recommendation would be to work with a legal counsel or at least sign up for their newsletters. So there are a lot of law firms that work in the hospitality space. Littler is one of them, Jackson Lewis, Fox Rothschild. So those are really important resources to use. Becoming a part of the Hospitality Alliance, becoming a part of SHRM. SHRM is a great resource. You don't have to be a professional to access some of their templates. So if you are building your processes from the ground up, really good resource to use for those tools. And then last but not least, obviously partnering with an outsourced HR party. That's why we created Empowered. We saw the need for small restaurants and small businesses to be able to access some sort of human resource person and company. And it provides a safer space for your employees to go to an outsourced third party rather than maybe feeling uncomfortable elevating scary, uncomfortable topics to someone like a manager or one of the owners.
Really great points. And I think we'll get to, I'll ask Theodora after we finish with Lauren. I think the size of the company also matters in certain situations, but I want to get to Lauren. Lauren, let's talk about the mission of Safe Bars and Defend Yourself. And I want to just underscore that while there are different types of harassment, there are different types of harassers. And a large number, surprisingly, and going back to the masculine harassment survey that One Fair Wage did, was customers. And this is difficult because there's a customer is always right sentiment that you have to serve the customer and you can't confront them. And yet what do you do when you're being harassed by them, which is really on the increase? So talk about how Safe Bars create and also Defend Yourself creates a supportive environment in training programs.
Thank you, Melanie, and I just want to say thank you for including me. So everybody who spoke before me really set the stage for what we deal with. So we are about changing the culture in individual establishments and therefore in greater communities. And we're also about what can I do as a person who works in hospitality? Yes, there are laws, but in my day-to-day, what can I do both to stand up on behalf of myself and to stand up on behalf of my coworkers? Excuse me. And one of the things that I talk about a lot when we're in non-COVID times and spending a lot of time in hospitality establishments is that you intuitively know what is the place that you would tell your friends it's a great place to hang out versus the place that you would tell your friends, oh, you want to stay away from there, right? And that is how you know, that's how you can identify a safe and respectful culture. And Safe Bars works on building a safe and welcoming environment for patrons, as well as a safe and respectful workplace for staff. And we don't care whether the harassment is patron to patron, patron to staff, staff to staff, or staff to patron. It doesn't matter who's doing the harassment. What matters, and Taryn in particular was talking a fair amount about the bystander role. What matters is that you are a witness to it and in a position to do something. And there are there are large social barriers to doing that. But in the United States, which is the only thing I can speak to, there is a lot of shared beliefs around minding your own business, or there's a lot of research on what are the barriers to getting involved. So one of them is things like minding your own business. One of them is, what if I say something or do something and make it worse? One of them is, well, nobody else is doing anything, so it must not be that bad. And my belief is that, and I think Theodora might have been mentioning this, that skills and practice are the antidote to those shared barriers. So that's what we do. We build on the skills that hospitality people already have. Hospitality people, by nature of being hospitality people, already have great relational skills and know how to read. You can read someone's facial expression or body language and tell whether they're happy with their meal or not. You don't have to go over and ask them, right? So we build on those same skills to give people the skills and the practice that they need to be more comfortable intervening. And as Taryn, I think, was mentioning, there are many, many different ways to intervene, and you can choose the ones that work the best for your personality and also for your identities, because we're also looking at things like gender and race and size and et cetera, when you're deciding which is the safest and most effective way to step in. The other thing that I want to mention is that, so we're about creating safe and respectful cultures in individual establishments and hopefully spreading that to communities and the industry in general. The other thing that I want to mention is that, hold on, I had a brain glitch. I'll come back to it. Another thing I want to say is that with the pandemic, we're obviously not doing training in establishments, most of which are closed and just trying to, survive the pandemic. But we did see a need for skills for dealing with problematic patrons escalated by the pandemic. Okay, so people are more stressed, people are more angry. They're giving frontline workers a harder time. The racism and sexism is particularly at the beginning of the pandemic around, Trump was fanning the flames that China brought the pandemic. So there's a lot of escalated racism and sexism, and then there's just kind of people taking their anger and stress out on frontline workers. The stuff that Saru was mentioning about refusing to wear a mask, threatening people who are wearing masks. So what we've done in response to all of this is launch hospitality-focused de-escalation workshops, where we share skills for bringing the temperature down to increase your safety and the safety of the people around you. In all of our trainings, we are trauma informed. We know that there are survivors in every room. And our trainings are all practical and interactive. They're not webinars, they're not videos. They are what we know about how people learn and adapt new skills and habits is that they have to participate.
Are these available to anybody free of charge, or is there can an employer sign up their staff?
Yes, so that's a good question. So hold on one sec, I just remembered my other thing. You can do it any number of ways. So you can sign up as an individual, and it is on a low sliding scale. but if you don't, I can't remember what the lowest number is, $10 maybe, $15. But if you don't have that, no one is turned away for inability to pay. So it is open to everybody. So you can sign up as an individual. And then we also do organizational, where an establishment, an owner or a manager will come and ask us to do it for their employees, and we will do it for that group, which has some advantages because then people are building a shared culture by doing it together.
Great point.
The other thing I just wanted to mention is that we deal with the whole spectrum of gender-based violence and other kinds of oppression-based violence. So it could be racism, it could be immigration status, et cetera, which are all very relevant in the industry. We deal with the whole spectrum. So not just the things that rise to the level of crime, not just the things that violate the law, not just the things that merit a HR complaint, but the day-to-day things that are lower level, but are still problematic. And we want to empower people to have the tools to manage those both on their own behalf. So we also teach boundary setting and assertiveness and things like that, and on other people's behalf, which is why the bystander.
I think it's important from all the threads is getting people the resources and tools, as well as the training and education, can really raise the bar. Thank you to all the panelists. We're going to start taking questions from attendees. I have a few by me that came in prior to the start, and then Catherine Gordon and Carrie or Schanenberger are going to send them to me. I want to ask a question that came up to Theodora. Is there a statute of limitations on filing harassment cases?
Yes, there is. And the good news is that in California in 2019, they extended the statute of limitations from 1 year to 3 years to pursue a sexual harassment or other type of harassment. In 2020, New York extended their sexual harassment statute of limitation from 1 year to 3 years. Now, the EOC has a 180-day, 300-day, but check your local state laws. But New York and California, I can speak to, have a 3-year statute of limitation. And then even though you have that statute of limitation, you may have a way of extending it beyond those things through something called a continuing violation theory. So if one act took place within the 3-year statute of limitation, but it's a continuation of something that occurred 5 or 6 years ago, and you can tie it to the same situation, you may be able to go back even further. But those are the statute of limitations. And that's why it's so important to bystanders, encouraging them to act, try to diffuse the situation. And I know a lot of restaurants don't have HR folks. I know a lot of people in the hospitality industry don't have it. But every company, no matter how big, should have 1 or 2 people designated within your organization to receive complaints. That can be done if it's the owner, the president, the front of the house, the back of the house, and it should be at least 1 woman and at least a man. It should be 1 person of each sex so that people feel empowered to speak out.
Really great point. And thank you, because I know that was a question I had. I'm going to take additional questions. So Catherine Gordon and Carrie are going to help me here. So somebody asked advice if unsolicited, this is kind of interesting, unsolicited photos are being taken. What can you do about it? Being sent, so a lot of this is about back of the house and if unsolicited advances or photos. I think back of the house and front of the house, the protection and behavior needs to be the same, but who would like to take this on?
I can speak
Ashley.
to part of it. Yeah. So if Obviously, front of house, you're more out in the open. People can see you. Back of house, usually you're contained and not as visible to all of your guests and to everyone else. So definitely still as prevalent in terms of harassment. Are there video cameras? Can you afford to install them so you can review footage? During investigations, we're obviously going to talk to anyone who was a witness, who was a bystander. So we'll get all of the different points of view, but then also making sure that you have some sort of policy in your handbook that speaks to social media, that speaks to taking pictures. So being able to review all of that during an investigation really gives a much clearer picture to what is happening, and that we can then hold the appropriate people accountable.
What happens if your harasser is your boss? Who do you go to in that instance?
Yeah.
Hopefully, go for it, Saru.
So we are an organization of service workers across the country and represent workers all over the country in legal action all the time, and can also support them in organizing and understanding their rights, that when you speak up or you want to get together with other workers and push back against a manager, an owner, an operator, that you're protected under the law to do that. So people, if their complaint is against their owner, the answer is they can come to us. But I do also want to speak to the, I see the questions from Joanne, and I also want to speak to the back of the house, because I think it's so wonderful to hear all the different programs, resources, training, services for workers in our industry when they're thinking about sexual harassment. And I think the time has come, as Alpana talked about, to think about structural change and really what it's going to take to not just address the sexual harassment when it's happening or after it happens, but to stop it from happening in the first place. And let us talk about sexual harassment for back of house women in the back of the house. There is an underlying culture towards women in this industry that they are not just objects, not just prey for objectification, but in fact, as I mentioned earlier, because of the subminimum wage, because of tips and the structure of tipping, that they're in fact encouraged to subject themselves to objectification. I can't tell you the number of young women who've said to me that they were sent home and told to go dress more sexy and come back to work with more revealing clothing, or that they were told, a woman told me, I complained about men grabbing my butt, and I was told, you're so lucky to get it while you're young. And that idea that you're so lucky to get it is so prevalent in our industry, because the idea is that if you can encourage, or if people harass you, if you are harassed, that means that you'll make more money in tips. The connection is so subtle and so clear. And so how does that impact back of house women? Well, if the majority of women are in the front of the house, the back is very male, there are few women there, but women in a whole restaurant are encouraged. Most of the women are in the front, and they're encouraged to subject themselves to objectification, to show more cleavage, to wear tighter clothing. Then that makes every woman in the restaurant, back and front, fair game. It makes every woman in the restaurant subject to not just objectification, but that she should welcome objectification, because everybody knows you make more money if you welcome objectification. So fundamentally, we have to deal with the structural problem. And I do want to say, during the pandemic, we were overwhelmed with the number of independent restaurant owners, men, women of all races, who came to us and said that they had changed their mind on this issue, that they had decided that the time had come to move to a full minimum wage with tips on top, because there's something not everybody understands. That is that we got a bill passed in 2018 in Congress that says that if you pay the front of the house a full minimum wage, tips actually can be shared with all non-management staff in the restaurant, including back of house. And our research on restaurants that already do that in the 7 states, California, Oregon, Washington, Nevada, Minnesota, Montana, and Alaska, and many other restaurants who've started to move in this direction in other states, even though they're allowed to pay a subminimum wage, they pay a full minimum wage so that tips can be shared. It not only creates a more unified sense of team, it actually makes it more affordable. To Joanne's question, there's a structural advantage for restaurants to move in this direction. There's not as much wage inequity, but it also reduces sexual harassment. How? Well, right now there's such gender segregation and stratification between front and back. The women in the front are dependent on tips. The men mostly men in the back get a full wage. When you make it so that everybody gets a full wage and tips are shared, it creates a more unified sense of team. The incentive to make the meal just as the customer ordered it is not just falling on the women, it is something that everybody shares. And the idea that a man could say, well, flash for me or kiss me in order to get the meal made just as the customer ordered it goes away, because everybody gets access to the tip. So there's something very unifying and beautiful about moving in a new direction as an industry, moving in an entirely new direction. And to your point, Joanne, the fact that Biden has included this in his COVID relief bill not only signals that there's a deep understanding that this is a COVID issue, it's an emergency, and everything has changed during the pandemic to reveal why this never worked. But it also means that in a matter of weeks, we could see the whole industry moving in a better direction, in which we can now, for once and for all, break down these barriers of front and back, men and women, racial divides in our industry that really perpetuate the inequality and power dynamics that are at the source of the sexual harassment. So let's talk about training and support and legal action, but let's all together work so that we can end these structural issues as well.
Interesting, because there's a lot of comments coming in about how there needs to be a seismic shift. It's an industry shift to make this happen. It can't be small steps. A couple of other questions. So somebody just asked, what should you do what is the steps for, what should the first thing a manager do when a harassment complaint is brought to their attention if the company does not have an HR resource? Who wants to take that on?
I can take it.
Okay.
So this happens often. A lot of times small companies don't have an HR resource. So I know it tends to be like a disruption in operations, but it's so important to act and not put it off, which I think a lot of people do. So listen to the person, write everything down, find out who was involved, who could have witnessed it, and then launch your investigation. Call everyone in, have a face-to-face conversation, really make sure that everything is documented so that you have a whole file of information that you can use to come up with your final report. So I would say the most important thing is to act. Don't put it off. Don't say, no, I don't think that happened. Don't take sides. Really just stay focused. It's very black and white. Find out the facts and then go from there.
Really great point. I just read this book by Lisa Donovan, Our Lady of Perpetual Hunger, talked about the harassment. I won't say who, but harassment, the harassers have a mental health problem. We have to also address the mental health problem, not only of those who are the victims, and I don't like the word victim, but those who are the subjects of harassment, but harassers as well. If you work in an industry, and it's hard when it's the boss, it's the chef, it's the owner, which is often the case, as we've seen in recent articles, this has come out. What do you do when you know someone has a mental health problem and is harassing? How do you get help for that person while also helping the staff and team who are, they're kind of paralyzed. They don't know what to do. Who wants to take that?
I know for me, I think what I find has been very helpful is provide coaching, one-on-one coaching with that particular individual, because oftentimes they're very much unaware by how their behaviors impact others. I always say that when something like this happens and harassment is exposed, it's an opportunity for learning. It's an opportunity for the employer to bring in training. It's an opportunity to revisit the handbook, which, by the way, I think 60% of people never read more than the first page. Unless you actually need the information and you've been a victim to something, most people don't read the handbook. So having trainings or even just meetings around what is in the handbook is impactful. So I think coaching, I would definitely encourage investing in coaching with that employee if you feel that you're invested in that employee and to gain some more self-awareness. And that's the first thing that comes to my mind.
I think
That's
that's a
good.
really good point. Yes,
Yeah,
Saru?
well, it's hard if the person is the owner, right? It's not like you can
Tough.
force them
Yeah.
to participate. But what we have seen, what we're really trying to push for beyond the structural change that I mentioned, is really the notion of restorative justice. And this is kind of a new, it's not new in the rest of the world, it's new in America. But the idea that instead of, the criminal justice system exists, which oftentimes does not actually satisfy, we say survivors, we don't say victims, we say survivors of sexual harassment or sexual assault. It doesn't actually, somebody going to jail or somebody getting fined or getting sued doesn't actually resolve the issue a lot of times for survivors. Restorative justice is a tried and true process, and there's years and years and years of experience and people who know how to do this, where you form restorative justice circles. Obviously, the owner would have to be willing to participate, but we've created a peer community of employers that are committed to better wages and working conditions, 800 restaurant companies around the country. If that kind of peer community can encourage a restaurant owner to participate in a restorative justice circle in which the survivor and the accused person, the perpetrator, is able to talk together about what the person did and the impact that it had on people. Oftentimes survivors find that so much more rewarding, meaningful than the person getting fined or frankly not facing anything at all or going to jail or anything like that. Being able to have a restorative justice meaningful conversation where people hear the impacts of their behavior and are able to acknowledge them and work together on a plan to change them is much more impactful.
Very good point. Lauren, you messaged me that it's, I mentioned mental health, and one of the reasons is there's a big article out there about a chef who has said he's facing difficulty, but you said it's not about mental health. So what is it about? And more importantly, how do you help the people that you're training?
It's about gender oppression. It's about patriarchy. I mean, I think Saru was talking about it in the beginning. Of course, some harassers have mental illness. Mental illness is way underdiagnosed and treated in our society because there's such a stigma about it. But mostly it is our culture and our societal norms that are allowing this abuse of power. And I don't think we can pathologize. I don't think it's useful to pathologize the people who engage in it. They're doing something that is sorry for the $10 words, but normatively accepted, right? What we have to do is change the culture and change the norms. And restorative justice is one of the ways to do that. One of the things that happens in Safe Bars trainings that is relevant to what you were just saying a minute ago is that the people who hold the attitudes that it is okay to treat women and gender nonconforming and non-binary and queer people in these ways hear a conversation that's different. And in our trainings, very rarely do participants say victim blamey type things. When they do, usually the group takes care of it, right? So someone will say something like, why was she wearing that? And, other coworkers will say things like, dude, that doesn't make a difference. And, and definitely they get the idea that that's not something that you should say out loud. And hopefully they get the idea that is actually the content of it is problematic. So that's something else that training accomplishes, is that it not only empowers people to step up when they see a problem, whether it's directed at them or at someone they're witnessing, it also helps shape the culture of the place and helps bring along the people who have the attitudes that support harassment.
Lauren, I want to underscore, we had a question, we've been talking about harassment against women, but as you said in your presentation, what Safe Bars and Defend Yourself works to work with all types of harassment,
Right.
Whether it's, against, non-binary and gay and, it's harassment is harassment in the sense that it needs to be reported, the behavior needs to be stopped. There needs to be a safe environment for all kinds of harassment. As Theodora said, there's different kinds of harassment. And we need to create a safe, structured space for people to go and the bystanders to go to report it and not feel there's going to be retaliation or it's going to hurt their job. It's going to carry them with them for the rest of their life. Alpana, you own restaurants and you have come from a place where you were verbally harassed. Your harassment was like bullying harassment. And they really, and what have you done as an operator in your own businesses to create foster a supportive environment? And another question that keeps popping up is how do you deal with it with the pandemic when people are so hostile to something as simple as wearing a mask?
Well, I think that it goes to, again, culture, and you can't spell culture without cult. And it's very easy for restaurants to go from culture to cult. And cult is a system where you're afraid to speak out against the brainwashed norm for fear of being ostracized. Culture, in my opinion, tends to be healthy. Everyone feels like they can contribute to the overall sort of vibe. And I think the thing that's most important to remember is that as an owner, you don't own the culture. Your employees set the culture and you're there to foster and grow it. But also be the kind of a caretaker of it and make sure that it is indeed healthy. And when you see examples of it not being healthy, then you need to step in and, get rid of the weeds. But I think to the point of I think the single most important thing that you can do is if somebody comes to you with an issue or problem, is you set aside a time and you make sure that the environment is sacred. You pull out a piece of paper, you sit with them, your body language, everything, you put your phone away and you make eye contact and you listen to them. And you allow them to speak, you record it, you write it, and then you give them a time frame. Like, okay, so, and you read it back to them and say, okay, let me get this straight. I just want to make sure I have everything, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And then you ask them, what does resolution look like for you? What do you want to see happen that will make you feel satisfied that you got some resolution here? And you're like, okay. And then you then go do your investigation. And then you come back and you lay it out as far as like, what exactly is going to happen. And then you make sure that they're satisfied with that. And both parties involved, obviously. And if there is an issue where there was something egregious that took place, you take care of it right away. And I think a lot of my philosophy also comes from the fact that I used to be a server, and it's a very different mindset because firsthand what it feels like when you feel like you weren't heard or it wasn't taken seriously. And that right there, to have that sense of, and I don't want to use the word disgruntled because that sounds bad, but that grows like a cancer. It's like a tumor. And it festers and festers and festers. And you definitely don't want an employee who feels like they're not being heard. And, I think the worst thing that can happen in an environment is where the employee doesn't feel comfortable coming to you. Like, that's really bad. That means, that I failed. And then as far as like the other entities concerned, I think that it, like I said, it just makes sure that everybody just feels like they have a place that they can come to kind of air those grievances. And then as far as like where customers are concerned, where they've stepped over the line, I mean, my employees will tell you, I'm the first one to step in there, go, no, you don't do that. My mother was a server, my mother was a waitress, and my dad was a waiter, and he worked in kitchens. So my whole family's worked in restaurants. And I remember as a kid, my mom coming home and almost in tears, where a patron had harassed her and said something mean to her, and the manager did nothing, and she had to just take it, because she had bills to pay. And I promised myself that I was never going to be like that. And so when a customer steps out of line and does something that I think, no, we don't do that, I want to make sure that my server doesn't have to go home and cry in front of their kids like my mom did in front of me. It's a very helpless feeling. And so I just make sure that, you just nip it in the bud. And I've told customers, I actually told one customer one time, here's the deal, I'm going to buy your dinner, but the deal is you can't come back. And there's another, you need to tell everybody that not to eat here, because I don't even want people who consider you friends to come here. Wow. You're an awful human being. And I actually told a woman one time that she took the joy out of running restaurants. And she was like, nobody has ever spoken to me like that. And I said, I find that very hard to believe, and that's just what it is. And I saw Miguel de Leon is on here, and, Miguel posts all the time about this, of like, you cannot allow this behavior to perpetuate against your employees. These are people who show up every single day, and go to the front lines for you, and you can't take care of them when they're being harassed, and you have no business being in the restaurant business. I'm sorry, you just don't.
Well, it kind of goes to this. Would you let someone treat a family member that way? Would you allow that? Because your employees are your family. They are what helps your business succeed. So you need to think of it that way. We're getting to the end. I want to keep this on time.
Say one thing about that,
yes,
because
Saru.
Over the years, as we've, fought against many of these issues, some employers have said, how could you accuse me of this? This is my family. And we say, well, it's a very dysfunctional family if people can be harassed and paid $2 an hour. So I think that there's a beautiful thing about feeling like a family in a restaurant, but I do think it's important to remember it is a workplace, and these are professionals. They are not disposable. They are not low-wage workers. They are skilled professionals who deserve to be treated, from the dishwasher to the busser to the server. They are skilled professionals, and they deserve to be treated as the skilled professionals that they are. They deserve to be paid as skilled professionals, and they deserve to be treated. And I think it all goes together. It's very hard to think of yourself or to think of someone as a professional when they're paid $2 an hour. It's very hard to think of a woman as a skilled professional when she is at the whim and mercy of every man in the restaurant, and having to put up with anything that is coming their way because she's so dependent on tips. So I think if we want to move towards a beautiful future where we are skilled professionals, and yes, there are elements of being in a family that we can bring into the workplace, but it is a workplace and these are professionals. I do want to be clear about that.
I want to go one step further, which is, it's not just, would you treat your family this way? It's people are human beings and everybody deserves respect. Punto finale, like that's where it starts. And yes, on top of that, it's good for your business to treat people with respect. It's good, you'll have less turnover, you'll have more patrons, all of that kind of stuff. So if people can't connect with the humanity of it, let's connect them with the business argument.
Mm-hmm. And for the first time in US history, we have 5 generations that make up our workforce. And in a couple of years, 60% of the workforce will be made up of millennials. And I think the millennial generation is going to help us move this conversation forward because they are the generation that doesn't like BS. They want good, positive work experiences. And if they don't get it, you will lose them. So when we're talking about retaining these wonderful people that we bring on, that goes back to culture. And I think this is a big piece to that conversation in terms of retaining, especially the millennials.
Really great point. Panelists, we've come to the 1:30 mark. Before we wrap, does anyone want to make, first of all, for all of you who have other questions, we will, with the panelists' permission, provide information. We have all their social media handles. You can direct message them on Instagram or Twitter and they will respond. Does anyone else want to have a final say that a point to bring across before we close?
I just want to say really quick, for anyone that's in an HR role or works in a restaurant or, I mean, really, I'm really speaking more to leadership right now. No news isn't always good news. Just because people aren't reporting, and a lot of us on this call are probably thinking, we haven't had any of those issues, it doesn't apply to us. I think that's one of the biggest misconceptions, that if there's any takeaway from today, to just present the opportunity to have these conversations multiple times with your employees, because just because they're not reporting it doesn't mean it isn't happening. It just may mean they don't know who to go to, or maybe the person they're supposed to go to is doing the harassing, or it could be just a number of issues with that. So I say keep having the conversations. It can't hurt to do that.
Thank you,
I can't
Taryn.
tell you how many trainings I've been in where the owner has sat in and listened to the conversations and at the end has said, I can't believe how much you all deal with every day. Like
Wow.
how much they've stopped, put a stop to, how many problematic customers they've managed, et cetera, et cetera. I just want to piggyback on you, Taryn, and say owners often don't know.
Yep. Yeah.
Knowledge is powerful. Anyone else?
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I want to thank you all for joining us again. This has been a great panel, and thank you to all the attendees who took the time out of the day to participate and ask questions. I want to underscore that this will be available, the full webinar, at www.ldny.org and on YouTube. And we'll be sending a questionnaire to all of you. We'd love your feedback. Send more questions. We'll make sure that they get to the respective panelists. I'm more than happy to take that on and share that so they can get back with you. Again, we want to thank our sponsors, Institute of Culinary Education. Thank you, Colangelo Partners, for managing the webinar, so I don't have to think about technology right now. Thank you, Catherine Gordon, for vetting questions. And again, to learn more about La Dame d'Escoffier, a great organization that supports and empowers women of all areas in the industry, go to www.ldny.org and the national organization, www.ldei.org. Thank you all. Be well, stay safe, listen, support, empower.
Thank you so much for inviting us.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you for the opportunity.
Absolutely. Thank you.